The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his former Military Affairs Minister Yoav Gallant over war crimes against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. What was the role of South Africa in this historic decision? Iran and South Africa share a lot of commonalities vis-à-vis the issue of Palestine. How can these two countries collaborate to end the genocide in Gaza and ensure that Palestine is free? For answers on these questions and other questions, we are talking this week to South Africa's ambassador to Iran, Dr. Francis Molloy. Stay with us. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for Israeli regime's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his former Military Affairs Minister Yoav Gallant. A panel of 3 judges issued the historic arrest warrants for crimes against humanity and war crimes committed from at least the 8th of October 2023 until at least the 20th May 2024, the day the prosecution filed the applications for warrants of arrest. These overdue warrants came weeks after South Africa filed its memorial to the International Court of Justice on the 20th of October 2024. The memorial, the name for the document recording the main case of South Africa against the Israeli apartheid regime, contains evidence which shows how this brutal regime violated the Genocide Convention by promoting the destruction of Palestinians living in Gaza. South Africa's evidence on Israel's genocidal war against Palestinians is detailed in over 750 pages of texts supported by exhibits and annexes of over 4,000 pages. South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice is a comprehensive presentation of the overwhelming evidence of genocide in Gaza perpetrated by the Israeli apartheid regime. So why did the ICC not include genocide charges in its indictment against the 2 notorious Israeli war criminals?
South Africa fighting for Palestine.
And to discuss the ICC warrants against Israeli war criminals Netanyahu and Gallant, and also the ongoing South Africa's case against the Israeli regime over its genocide in Gaza. We are joined here in the studio today by Dr. Francis Molloy, South Africa's ambassador to Iran. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for your time.
Thank you indeed for inviting me, and greetings to everyone at home.
Now, Mr. Ambassador, as you know, the ICC has issued arrest warrants against these 2 Israeli war criminals, Netanyahu and his war minister, Gallant. Now, first, we'd like to know what role, if any, did South Africa play in this case or this warrant issued by the ICC against these 2 war criminals?
In November last year, South Africa, along with other countries like Djibouti, the Comoros, I think Bolivia, Venezuela, approached the ICC, saying to the ICC that what has been happening in the Gaza Strip, particularly after the events of the 7th of October last year, what Israel has been doing there amounted to crimes over which the ICC has jurisdiction. And we approached the prosecutor at the ICC to investigate in order to find out who is responsible and bring those people to book. And we are glad that at the end of that process, the arrest warrants have now been issued against the 2 war criminals in Israel.
While people around the world have welcomed and acclaimed the arrest warrants issued against these war criminals over their crimes in Gaza, we also know that South Africa has an ongoing case against the Israeli regime at the International Court of Justice over the regime's genocidal war against the people of Gaza. Now, but these indictments issued by the ICC, they did not include genocide, but rather war crimes or crimes against humanity. What's your take on this? Why did the ICC refrain from using the term genocide, while we all know that what is happening in Gaza is pure genocide?
Yes, the crime of genocide is one of those crimes over which the ICC has jurisdiction.
Yeah.
But from my reading of the decision of the ICC in issuing the arrest warrants, yeah, it focused very narrowly on the request that the prosecutor submitted.
Okay.
And I would believe that there was overwhelming evidence to suggest that there were very clear war crimes that were being committed, like the crimes against humanity, using starvation as a weapon of war. Mm-hmm. I do believe that in his request, the prosecutor also had included, I guess, the crime of genocide. Yeah. But as I say, given the narrow scope that the court was focusing on, it focused on the war crimes and crimes against humanity. But one thing that is very important in the court's decision, it also used words to the effect that what Israel has been doing in Gaza amounted to the creation of conditions that are aimed at destroying the population of Gaza in whole and in part. And if you look simply at that, at the use of that word, of those words, those are the words in the Genocide Convention that describe some of the actions that constitute genocide.
Mm-hmm. Now, we have seen that these two international courts, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, ICC, they have put the Israeli regime on notice over its genocidal war in Gaza and its war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I think what many people are asking right now is that, now, despite the warrants that have been issued and also the ICJ advisory, I think, over South Africa's case of the ICJ, there is concern that the Israeli regime still continues with its genocidal war against the Palestinians in Gaza, particularly even after the ICJ ruling, if we'll call it, and after the recent ICC warrants issued. The following day or hours after that, the Israeli regime bombarded the Gaza Strip. And people are asking, I mean, can these two international courts, legal mechanisms, put an end to this genocide?
Well, the ICC and the ICJ are international courts of law.
Yeah.
And what they are dealing with is to decide cases and apply the rules of international law over the facts that are before them. Yeah. Unfortunately, these two courts do not have their own police forces, and they do not have, they do not also have their own law enforcement agencies. That is the responsibility of us, member states of these two legal institutions, that when they issue rulings, we have the responsibility, because we are signatories to the Rome Statute of the ICC, we are members of the ICC, to comply with the rulings of this, in this case, the ICC, and in the case of the ICJ, those provisional measures that it issued. Israel has an obligation to respond, and we also have an obligation to ensure that we do everything in our power to comply with our responsibilities under these two international courts of law. So at the end of the day, as I say, it is our responsibility to ensure that we can enforce, we can live by our obligations. And that is the only way in which we can give meaning to the rulings and the decisions of these two courts and any other international mechanisms that are aimed at fostering accountability.
Now, no doubt, I mean, ICC's decision is significant. But the other major area of concern is that these warrants have been issued against the Israeli regime's prime minister and his war minister. First, the Israeli regime is not a member of this court, and also its main backer, because you know the genocide in Gaza is a U.S.-Israeli genocide. The U.S. is also not a member of the ICC, and it has actually threatened ICC judges and prosecutors. How do you see these as a lawyer? What will be the impact of these indictments, considering the fact that these two, the U.S. and the Israeli regime, are not members?
You are absolutely right. And we have heard from both the apartheid regime in Israel and from the United States that their argument has always been that since apartheid Israel and the United States are not members of the Rome Statute, the ICC does not have jurisdiction over these officials from the Israeli government. But they are wrong in law. They are completely wrong in law. The state of Palestine is a member of the Rome Statute. These crimes that Gallant and Netanyahu are now responsible for were committed in the occupied Palestinian territory. And the ICC has jurisdiction over the Gaza Strip, over the West Bank, and over East Jerusalem, because these are Palestinian territories. And therefore, the ICC was right in taking this case and establishing jurisdiction and doing the investigation and issuing these arrest warrants. Both apartheid Israel and Washington have dismissed these warrants, but I think they are dismissing these warrants at their own peril, if I may use that term, because as we sit here, both Netanyahu and Gallant are wanted war criminals.
Fugitives.
Exactly, and that is not going to change. That's not going to change. And you would have seen recent developments, particularly from some Western capitals, and some of which are the strong backers of apartheid Israel and the allies of the U.S. They have clearly stated that as members of the ICC, they will comply with the decision of the ICC as far as these warrants of arrest are concerned. So the fact is, at this moment, if and when these two war criminals travel to any of these countries in the West who are members of the ICC, we expect them, as they have said, to arrest them. And this is monumental if you look at how apartheid Israel over many decades has operated essentially with impunity, with no red lines in the sand. But these arrest warrants now for the first time draw solid red lines in the sand, and that is the significance of these arrest warrants.
And Mr. Ambassador, actually, I mean, these arrest warrants also have brought about double standards. They've shown the world that there are double standards in the international community. Or actually, the U.S. pursues double standards as a principle of its foreign policy. Why am I saying this? Because when the ICC issued arrest warrants against Russian President Vladimir Putin, the U.S. came all out in support of this warrant and encouraging ICC member states to arrest the Russian president. But then, again, when the ICC issued this arrest warrant against the Israeli regime's prime minister and his war minister over their war crimes in Gaza, and you know, they are real war crimes, unlike what was maybe happening in Ukraine, the U.S. has come out and said that it rejects and it's even threatening ICC officials. What's your take on these double standards by the U.S. and even some Western countries?
The position of the United States and other Western countries on issues such as these, and you're talking about the double standards, is unfortunate to say the least. Yeah. And it is attitudes like this that will make mockery of the international community's long-standing commitment to the rule of international law. Yeah. And we have created these institutions, whether it is the UN and all these other courts, in response to the barbarism of the Second World War. Yeah. And to have these countries undo all that work that we have done is unfortunate indeed. Mm-hmm. And that is why we will not and we should not accept a global order where certain rules apply to certain countries and certain rules apply to others. Otherwise, we do not have international law. Yeah. Otherwise, we do not have standards. Yeah. We live in a jungle. Yeah. We live in a world order where might means right. Yeah. And the history is replete with examples of atrocities that can be committed when we live with that mindset and attitude. And the United States always claims that it is the leader of the free world. They uphold international law. Yeah. They respect international humanitarian law. They are committed to international human rights and so on. The taste of the pudding is in the eating. And actions speak louder than words. And therefore, they got to put their money where their mouth is, so that we can have the kind of international order that serves the interests of all and not others.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for that. Viewers, we now take a short break before we continue with our discussion with South Africa's ambassador to Iran on the recent ICC arrest warrants against Israeli war criminals and South Africa's case against the Israeli regime at the ICJ.
South Africa fighting for Palestine.
Welcome back to Africa Today. This week, we are talking to South Africa's ambassador to Iran, Dr. Francis Molloy, on the recent ICC arrest warrants against the Israeli war criminals, Netanyahu and Gallant, and also South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice against the Israeli regime over its genocidal war in Gaza. Now, Mr. Ambassador, recently, South Africa presented evidence at the ICJ of the Israeli regime's genocide in Gaza. Can you briefly elaborate on this evidence which you presented?
Yes. Our case against apartheid Israel has now moved into the merits stage, where we are now required to present evidence to prove the intent to commit genocide on the part of the apartheid state of Israel. And last month, at the end of October, we submitted our memorial to the ICJ, a very long dossier of over 4,000 pages, in which we provide evidence in the form of statements that were made by the officials of the apartheid state. We provide evidence of the actual actions on the ground in Gaza by the IDF. We provide visual material of what the IDF has been doing and bragging about in Gaza. We also provide statements of other public officials in apartheid Israel, some people who are not even members of the Knesset, the public officials and ordinary people in Israeli society there, to show and to demonstrate conclusively that what Israel has been doing in Gaza amounts to genocide, and that all those actions that are stipulated, particularly in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, killing the Palestinians, causing them immense suffering, emotional and psychological harm, creating conditions that are calculated to bring about their destruction in whole and in part, preventing births and so on and so forth. So it's overwhelming evidence that we have now submitted, and we are still collecting this. So in a nutshell, that is exactly the evidence that we are presenting to the ICJ.
And there have been some reports, I think, Israeli apartheid regime's media outlets claiming that South Africa is being backed by other powers or other countries in its case against this apartheid regime at the ICJ. What do you have to say about these accusations?
Well, a few weeks ago, our Minister of Justice was asked in Parliament to give the details of how South Africa is conducting the case and looking at issues around expenditure, the finances, and so on and so forth. Because in Parliament, it's public accountability and all that, and transparency. And our minister was able to give to the parliamentarians and to the people of South Africa the breakdown of the costs that are involved in this. The financing of this comes from the taxpayers that South Africans, the tax money that South Africans contribute. And this is how it has been. In fact, our former Minister of International Relations and Cooperation was asked the same question last year. And she said that she's not aware of any outside funding from a particular country. So, however, we would like to see the whole world supporting us in this case against apartheid Israel.
And that brings me now to my next question. We have seen over the recent past that many countries have joined South Africa's case at the ICJ against the Israeli regime over its genocide in Gaza. Now, what impact will this have on the case and maybe the final judgment?
Well, this is important, because Israel, as I said earlier, has for many decades thought that it is above the law, that it can act with impunity as long as it is supported by its allies in the West. Well, that period has come to an end now. The international community and we as South Africa are making a very small and modest contribution in that regard. We want to see the apartheid regime in Israel and its officials brought to book for the crimes that they have committed against the Palestinians. Nelson Mandela once said, in the case of our own struggle, or his own struggle against apartheid, he said, sometimes the struggle and what you want to achieve may appear to be impossible until it is done, until it is achieved. So the same thing in the case of apartheid Israel. Many people tend to think, oh, we cannot do anything against Israel. They are backed and supported by the most powerful in the West. It is a sheer waste of time, and it is not until it is done.
And on that note, actually, there are reports that South Africa is under intense pressure to drop this ICJ case. In fact, some reports say that South African diplomats, I think in the West, have been warned that their country will pay the price if it continues with this ICJ case. Is your country under pressure to drop the ICJ case?
Well, obviously, there are a number of countries that are opposed to the course of action that we have taken. But our position is very clear. The Palestinian people supported our own struggle even though they were not free.
Not free, yeah.
Even though they were also facing the draconian apartheid regime in Israel, they supported our own struggle.
Yeah.
We are free today as South Africa, 30 years into our freedom. The question of Palestine still remains the most pressing issue on the conscience of humanity. And we cannot turn, now that we are free, turn our backs on our friends who supported us in our own liberation struggle. It took us 350 years living under colonialism, virulent racism, and apartheid. Yeah. And we hope that in the case of Palestine, it doesn't get there. Yeah. We are moved by our commitment to international law. Yeah. We are moved by our commitment to the right of self-determination, respect for international human rights, and so on and so forth. And the Palestinians have the right to enjoy this. So no one is going to put any amount of pressure on us to abandon our values and our commitment to the people of Palestine.
Mr. Ambassador, last question. Now, we know that Iran and South Africa share a lot of commonalities, and especially vis-a-vis the Palestinian issue and the issue of the liberation of Palestine. Now, how can these two countries enhance their collaboration to ensure that the genocide stops and Palestine is free?
Yes, both South Africa and Iran have the same commitment, as it were, to the question of Palestine. Yeah. And I think it requires all of us, South Africa, Iran, and our partners globally, to put our shoulder to the wheel and to do more to isolate the apartheid regime in Israel. So we should form a formidable coalition and an anti-apartheid, shall I say, wave against the apartheid Israel, in the same way as the international community did with apartheid South Africa.
Indeed.
And really take action that will force Israel to change. Kick the apartheid government out of the United Nations, impose an arms embargo, boycott them in all areas of interaction, sport, academic, culture, and so on and so forth. And when we do that collectively, that is one way in which we will bring pressure on apartheid Israel and bring about that. If history is anything to go by, we believe that it can be done. If it was done in the case of South Africa, it can be done in the case of apartheid Israel.
And Palestine will be free.
And Palestine will be free.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ambassador Francis Moloi, for your time today. And viewers, that was South Africa's ambassador to Iran, Dr. Francis Moloi, and we were discussing the recent arrest warrants by the ICC against the Israeli regime war criminals, Netanyahu and Gallant, and the ongoing South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice against the Israeli regime over its genocide in Gaza. Thanks a lot for watching, and it's always great having you watch the show. You can watch this episode and all our previous episodes